This week we'll be meeting a large and very successful group of lizards that are winning fans all over the world. Monitor lizards, or goannas as we affectionately know them in Australia, include the real giants of the lizard world. Of course, the title of world's largest lizard easily goes to the Komodo dragon that reigns supreme in its island home in Java. Growing up to 10 feet long and weighing up to 170 kilograms, this lizard is probably the only one that truly deserves the title dragon in the legendary sense of the word. However, in terms of sheer numbers of species, Australia is without question the world's stronghold of monitor lizards and the envy of reptile enthusiasts across the globe. From Varans primordius, the world's smallest species, to the huge parenti that rivals even the Komodo dragon in size, Australia's 27 species have colonised almost every available habitat across the vast, dry expanses of the continent. Many visitors to national parks along Australia's east coast will be familiar with what is possibly the most successful of the larger species, the lace monitor. Unfortunately, well-meaning picnickers can often overfeed these individuals and they can eventually become a pest. However, given the right care, these large lizards can make great captives and provide a very rewarding experience for the keeper. We visited Dr. David Kirshner in his Sydney apartment to find out what makes them tick.
Lace monitors are found right up and down the east coast of Australia, and they also extend a little bit west into South Australia. They're normally associated with forested areas, so even when they're out west, you usually find that they're along river courses and hang around the trees. And there's a lot of, in fact, Aboriginal legends and stories to do with goannas and with lace goannas, and they're always associated with trees. They're quite often, I mean, they're the most commonly seen monitor in eastern Australia, and they usually, for overseas visitors, it's the first goanna they're going to see. Goannas are incredibly fast-growing reptiles. They love a really hot basking spot, so they've got a much higher preferred body temperature than most other reptiles. So everything runs in overtime. They've got a really high metabolic rate, so they eat a lot, they grow quickly, and it all, how fast they grow depends on how much food you give them, but they will grow, they can get to close to adult size in a year. They get 3/4 adult size in a year. I tend not to like having them grow that quickly, so I'll pace them out a bit, but they are definitely a very fast-growing reptile. They're also a very, this whole high metabolism lifestyle, this is one of the things that makes them really interesting, is they're kind of like Australia's answer to the mongoose and weasels that you'd get in sort of Asia and Africa and North America, because Australia doesn't have very many mammalian predators, and that niche is filled by monitors. So as a consequence, there's a lot of species, and they're active predators. So they do a lot of things that a mammal will do, and their whole, the way they fit into the environment, I think, is very similar to those other predators. They're very much like a bird, and if you watch them, the way they watch things. When I walk into this room, I get two sets of eyes kind of staring at me, seeing if I've got food, looking at my hand, and they have that very bird-like quality, and they've got excellent eyesight. They'll see things from across the room. They're particularly good eyesight for movement, a really subtle movement from the other side of the room, or a plane off in the distance, which I think might be a bird of prey. But if they've got food right in front of them, they will only recognize this food by smelling it. So you can have a dead mouse in front of them, and they won't go, oh, there's a mouse, I'll have the tongue flick it. If it's moving, it's gone. A lot of people keep their goannas fed on dog food and that sort of thing, and it's not really a proper way to keep a goanna. In the wild, they will eat small animals, and I think the best way to make sure that they get the full complement of sort of nutrition and minerals and everything else is to give them small whole animals in captivity as well. So I tend to feed them mice, rats, day-old chicks, and insects. Everything except the insects is frozen and thawed. This is Alex, my male, and what he's doing is he's hoping to be let out of the enclosure. I normally let him out whenever he wants to be let out, just for a wander around. He can't understand why I'm sitting with my back to him and not letting him out. In the wild, lace monitors were usually only breed once a year. Because these ones are indoors, I can breed them more than once a year. And they're known in the wild, especially in the southern parts of the range. No one knows what happens up north, but in southern parts of the range, they're definitely known to nest in termite mounds. And there are a couple of good reasons for this. One being that they have a really long incubation period, really long for a reptile especially. It takes in the wild, it'd be about 10 months for the eggs to incubate. So the only way they're going to carry on right through a winter is if they don't get too cool. And termite mounds are temperature controlled and humidity controlled. And they're also really good for protection because the termites will seal the mound and then defend it from other nest invaders. So what I've done with my captives is I've kind of simulated a termite mound by making a nest box that's enclosed and heated and temperature and humidity controlled. And so far the female seems to love it. Unlike a lot of other lizards, courtship in monitors is usually very gentle. There'll be a lot of little head twitching signals between the male and the female. The female lets the male know that she's receptive. She'll walk away from him really slowly with her head down, and he'll very gently walk over the top of her until she stops moving, and then he'll coax her to lift her tail by doing some signals with his hind legs, kind of a guitar strumming motion. There's quite often a lot of foreplay with him very gently tongue flicking around her face and the rest of her body. And you can tell that he's got this really intense concentration because his pupils get really tiny. They'll continue mating for about a week, and then I'll keep the pair together probably for about 3 weeks. So I'll put a partition in the enclosure and separate them a week or so before she's going to lay eggs. So when the female is getting ready to lay eggs, she'll start doing little test digs into the nest box. She'll kind of dig little holes and check the temperature by sticking her snout in. And I call these nose holes. And I'll quite often notice a few nose holes around the enclosure during the day, and then sometimes these holes will get bigger and bigger and bigger in the big lead up to egg laying. And then usually on the day, or maybe the day before, she'll completely excavate a tunnel into the nest box. It'll go right to the bottom where the heat source is. And then on the day, she'll be quite restless, walking around a lot, and eventually late in the afternoon, we'll go down the hole, turn around, and sit quite often with her head or even her forequarters out of the nest, and we'll stay like that for 2 or 3 hours while she lays eggs. Now you can see when an egg is coming out because her body will flinch. And she's got a kind of a dopey look on her face. She's in a little bit of a trance and doesn't notice much around her while she's laying eggs. Once she's finished laying eggs, she'll come out of the nest box, turn around, stick her head back in, and then start pushing the eggs into place and pushing the substrate around them. And we'll keep doing this. We'll keep going in and out of the nest box until the eggs are completely covered over and the whole area looks like it's never been touched before. And then she'll quite often leave the nest box and then start digging around the enclosure, starting off trying to kick substrate back at the nest box itself, and then just kind of randomly digging around the place, which is just the hormones which haven't worn off yet. And it takes her sometimes up 12 to 24 hours for those hormones to wear off, and then she's ravenous, absolutely starving, and starts feeding again. One of the reasons I separate the male and the female before she lays eggs is immediately after laying the egg, she becomes really defensive of the nest site and will try to attack the male. She's fine with me. I can collect the eggs while she's watching and doesn't seem to register because I guess her instincts tell her that the most likely candidate for egg robbing is going to be another goanna, whereas humans haven't been in Australia long enough to register in their instinctual repertoire. The eggs are normally laid at a spot in the nest box that's around 30 degrees. So I'll usually check the temperature just out of curiosity and write it down. And I'll mark the eggs with a pencil on top of the eggs. I'll number them. That way, if they're rolled later in incubation, I know which is the right side up. And I'll put them into perlite, which is being mixed with water, and then cover the whole egg container with Glad wrap and put the lid on it to hold the Glad wrap in place. The lid has holes in it to allow gas exchange. Glad wrap's great for this because Glad wrap allows gas to pass in and out, whereas it holds the moisture in. Incubation takes, in captivity, takes anywhere from about 6 to 9 months, and so you have to be very, very patient. The longest I've had an egg take to hatch was 295 days, which is a long time to be biting your nails. The eggs start to dimple quite often, about a month before they hatch, where they're getting rid of excess moisture, and I know that they're in the lead up to hatching. And then one day I'll notice a little tiny slit in the egg, pipping. They've got a little tiny egg tooth, which is quite visible when they've got their head sticking out of the egg. And they'll slice up the egg, sometimes slicing it into ribbons, and then we'll have their head resting out of the egg for anywhere up to 12 to 24 hours after the initial slit. Once the eggs have slit, once they've done that initial pip, they'll quite often slice the end of the egg to ribbons and then stick their head out, and will rest like that for any length of time between 12, 24, sometimes even 48 hours. And what's happening while they're doing that, it's really important not to remove them from the egg when they're doing that, because they've been breathing via their umbilical cord through blood vessels on the surface of the egg, and they've got to wait for those blood vessels to close down and dry up, as well as the umbilicus, get used to breathing air, and then emerge fully intact with nothing dragging behind. I'll leave them in the egg box in the incubator for a couple of days after they've hatched, just to let them dry out and get used to walking around, and then I'll put them into the enclosure. How soon they start feeding depends on whether they've got a big yolk reserve. If they've got a huge belly, they may not start feeding for about a week, and if they're fairly thin when they come out of the egg, they might start feeding within a couple of days. I've never had a problem getting them to start feeding. That's one of the great things about goannas. They're just not one of those reptiles that refuses food. So this one here hatched just a couple of months ago. This is sort of last season's young. They're beautiful when they're small, just miniatures of the adults. They don't like being handled. I don't normally handle them much. I leave them alone until they're bold enough to want to interact with me on their own terms. But and they're not. The funny thing is that they have a reputation of being a bitey animal, but they're really they bite in self-defense. And if you move slowly, they're biting as a last resort. This one will probably have a few goes at me, but it's more of a defensive thing than anything else. You can see its throat's puffed out. The best way to get a baby to grow up into a calm adult, something that you can interact with when it's bigger, is to leave it alone. And it'll hide a lot. The first few months of a goanna's life, it's called empty cage syndrome. You've got an empty enclosure, you put food in every day, and you take an empty dish out every afternoon, and that's all you see. And then every now and then you might catch a glimpse of it out basking. It'll wait till you leave the room, and then it'll disappear, so you don't see where it's hiding. After a few months, they start realizing, if you don't handle them, if you don't pull them out of their hide spot or anything, they realize you're not a threat, and they'll start staying out basking while you're in the room. And then you can try to get it to feed from tongs. And once you've got it feeding, then it'll recognize that you're a source of food, as well as notice it's not trying to bite my hand, it's trying to bite the big face that's staring at it. Anyway, so once it's out and basking with you in the room, then you know that it's starting to get used to your presence, and you can start slowly trying to get to come up to you for food. And once you've got it really comfortable with sitting on a hand while you're feeding it with the other hand holding tongs, then you can try giving it a stroke under the chin every now and then. And it's just a matter of a whole lot of very small steps. It's kind of, if you try to imagine you had a wild possum that you're trying to get used to you wouldn't grab it and hold it until it stopped struggling. You'd never see it again. So you've got to sort of offer it food and have it slowly get used to it. And it can take months. My adult female took almost 4 years before I could handle her. Males tend to be really good. Males will calm down very, very quickly. That normally about 6 months, and they're used to people. I'm pretty sure this little one's a female. They're normally hard to sex at this size, but she's got the little head and skinny tail of a female. Now you notice that what looked like a yawn before, she's not suddenly bored with our company. That's a gape. Normally it's a much slower, drawn out like that, and that's a part of their threat repertoire.
While it may appear to be another species, the banded phase of the lace monitor, known as the Bell's form, is simply a regional variant from the western parts of its range. This attractive and highly sought-after morph commands a higher price than the more common striped version, but is becoming more readily available.
Okay, this is Varans brevicorda, world's smallest monitor species. This is actually a little gravid female here. You can see her big fat belly. This form is actually smaller than, I suppose, your average brevicorder. This is adult size. This is a form originating from Laverton in Western Australia that is at this stage probably an undescribed species. But yeah, a very pleasant little monitor. And at this stage, she's probably another week or two off laying eggs. The hatchlings of these little guys are only about that big in size, smaller than most of your gecko hatchlings. But for a small gecko, they have a very big attitude. They strut around like they're Gould's monitors. So very different in temperament to a lot of your other spiny tails. But yeah, quite a nice species to keep becoming very popular. Okay, this is how I set up most of my small burrowing monitors. Use a stack system from a basking point of view, and that stack system actually sits directly on a large container of sand, and that allows them to burrow in an area that has a temperature gradient from directly above it to cooler at the bottom. For a lot of your burrowing monitors, they'll tend to nest in the middle of that temperature gradient. They just enter via a little cut in the top tile over the other side there. And I use this for brevicorders, Varans acanthrus, and also my stores monitors, which all like to burrow up against something, and then they just use the deeper layers when it comes to nesting. Yeah, this is your northern blunt spine monitor, Varanus primordius. This is about a 3/4 grown animal. Interesting little fellas. Not good to be bitten by. They're one of the small species that has some kind of venom apparatus, so they sting for days after you get bitten by these fellas. Somewhat related to your stores monitors, but much smaller. Technically, these are actually probably the world's smallest monitor, but they have a longer tail than Varanus brevicorder, so they don't get that official title. But on snout vent length, they're certainly the smallest.
One of the most commonly kept species of pygmy monitor is Varanus acanthrus, or the ridge-tailed monitor. Growing to a maximum size of about 70 centimetres, these monitors are ideal for someone who doesn't have the space required for the larger species. They are comparatively easy to care for and come in a wide variety of regional colour variations, ranging from reds through to yellows and oranges. Being insectivores, they will thrive on a diet of crickets, wood roaches, mealworms and pinky mice. They also relish raw egg and mince on occasion. In the wild, they are almost always associated with rocky outcrops, where they quickly take shelter if disturbed. They are skilled at wedging themselves into the tightest possible spaces, with their spiny tail presenting a defensive barrier. I went out with licensed collector Dave McIntosh into the Great Sandy Desert to see if we could find a specimen of the West Australian form. On the way, a quick stop at a decommissioned ammunition dump yielded a beautiful Varanus tristis, another of the small monitors.
What a specimen. Check that out. Okay, this little specimen here, black-headed monitor. Varanus tristis is its scientific name. It often gets called black-headed monitor, black-tailed monitor. In WA here, what do we call it? Black-headed monitor. Commonly associated with abandoned buildings, are highly arboreal. We've just got this fella out of the abandoned ammunition dump behind us. It's clearly a boy. It's got these spurs down here, these clusters here. That indicates a boy on the species. They're not always easily to identify as what sexes they are, but this one is quite easy. Until recently, it's always been thought of as that lizards here in Australia were non-venomous. However, recent research has shown they actually do have venom glands, and although their venom is probably not harmful to us in any way, they've probably got benefits for medicine and further research. Who knows what they'll turn up.
After that bit of unexpected excitement, we drove on towards a rocky plateau that looked like excellent habitat for the ridge-tailed monitor. This soon proved to be the case.
Okay, this looks like quite a good area. Might turn up something here. There's a lot of exfoliation rock. Hang on, step back, step back. Yeah, not a bad little specimen. Not as attractive as I have seen, but yeah, still a nice condition. Quite a predominant goanus species here. Probably the most common one you're going to encounter around these rock crevices. Very common. But anyway, we've got no need to take him today, so we'll go and put him back where we found him.
As well as being simple to take care of and a convenient size, ridge-tailed monitors are also one of the easiest species to breed. Gravid females will lay an average of 5 eggs in early summer. If incubated at 30 degrees Celsius, they will hatch after about 3.5 months. Hatchlings are very cute, and when placed next to a 5-cent piece, you can see how tiny they are. Once they have emerged from the egg, babies should be placed in a container with a shallow water bowl, and after about 4 or 5 days, they will begin feeding on baby crickets and cat food. At the other end of the scale is Australia's largest lizard, the Perenti, which can grow to almost 8 feet long. They are active and extremely powerful predators with few natural enemies. Perenties have a preference for rock outcrops, but may range over very large distances in search of prey. In spring, males will locate receptive females through pheromone trails, and mating will take place frequently over a few days. Gravid females will then seek a suitable nesting site. The temperature of the burrow should be sufficient to incubate the eggs, and the female will determine if it is warm enough by using her nose as a probe. Test burrows that are too cool will be abandoned, and the female will keep digging until she finds one that is just perfect. Such a large and potentially dangerous lizard is not a suitable pet for everyone. However, given the right conditions and enough space, these attractive giants can be bred in captivity, and although still expensive, captive bred hatchlings are available from time to time. For the reptile licensing requirements that apply to you, please refer to your local National Parks office. The road test for this episode produced the following scores. For the lace monitor, normal lace monitor hatchlings go for about $500 each. The banded or Bell's colour phase goes for a few $100s extra, so on price I gave them a score of 4. The lace monitor is one of the most commonly kept of the large monitors, but they are not prolific breeders and have a very long incubation period, so you may have to make advance reservations for young. A score of 5 in this category. Housing for young lace monitors presents few problems, but adult-sized individuals require large enclosures. Best kept outdoors in a bird aviary or similar. A score of 5 here. Lace monitors require large amounts of heat, so indoor caging can become expensive, especially in the winter months. Outdoor enclosures should be furnished with robust decorations and allow the animals to gain access to plenty of sunlight. A score of 5 seems appropriate here. Will conveniently eat frozen thawed food, although adults will eat a lot, so I scored the lace monitor with a 9 in the fuel category. Wow factor. While being an impressive beast, an adult lace monitor will be a familiar sight to many people, so a wow factor score of 5 seems appropriate here, giving a total score of 33. For the ridge-tailed monitor, probably the cheapest monitor available at around $250 each, so a score of 7 on price seems fair. Also the most readily available, so a score of 7 in this category. Maintenance, the closest thing to a bulletproof monitor, so a score of 8 here. If provided with a good supply of flat rocks under which to hide and an adequate heat source, these lizards will thrive, even in a relatively small enclosure, a score of 8. Fuel, for the most part they require live food, so a lower score of 2 here. Wow factor, Some of the emerging selectively bred colour morphs are indeed impressive, so a score of 6 seems appropriate here, giving an overall score of 38.